Hello everyone, and welcome to this Blender tutorial. In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to create an almost 100% procedural copper material using the Cycles render engine. Procedural just means it's generated within the software, so I won't be using any external programs to help me achieve this effect. So let's begin. So open up your scene. For my scene, I just have a simple backdrop with a simple 3-point lighting system. I have a key light, a fill light, and a backlight. And of course my object, my monkey head. So to begin, drag up your timeline, and you'll be wanting to change the viewport to node editor. So if you are new to Cycles, and you have never really used materials before, to begin with, you probably would have used this interface here, just like in Blender Internal. But if you'll see, most people, their materials are they have much more complex setups with many nodes. This is actually a better way, and it may look intimidating at first, but trust me, once you get into it, it's quite easy, and it's not too scary. Okay, so to begin, click New, and we will have our regular diffuse shader. So at this point, I'll be wanting to go to my rendered viewport. You'll see that only some of my viewport is actually being rendered because I used the border feature. You do this by hitting Shift B and just selecting what you want to be rendered. This is very useful if you're like me and you're stuck on a very slow CPU, because your GPU is not compatible with Blender. So doing this actually saves you a lot of render time and a lot of time waiting around to see what your material looks like. And one more thing before we begin is you'll see my scene is actually being lit by an HDR image. If you would like to use one, they have a very wide selection of HDRs, and you can choose whichever one you want. It's openfootage.net, but again, I'll be leaving a link in the description. Alright, so let's begin. So, first, name your material. This is a good habit to get into. When you start making larger scenes, it's easy to see what materials you have and which ones you'll use. Okay, so to begin, we're going to get rid of our diffuse shader. Just select it and press X. We're going to be replacing it with a glossy shader. So go Shift A, shader, glossy, and connect it here. Okay, so now this is more what we're looking for. It's just more of a metallic look. So, first thing we'll be wanting to do is giving our material an overall color. You could, of course, just go to color and think, oh, what does copper look like? Oh, it's a bit orange reddish. That'll do. Yeah, you could do this, or if you wanted to, this is actually a very good idea. When you are creating materials that appear in the real world, like copper here in this instance, or gold, or whatever you're doing, it's actually quite a good idea to look up the hex code for the material. If you don't know what the hex is, if you go to color here, and we click on hex, so if you look up on Google or wherever a hex code for copper, you will actually find a very accurate code for what copper actually looks like. It may seem a bit silly, but it's a very good idea, as it looks it's a subtle change. It just makes it look more believable. I'll be leaving the hex codes in the description for you, but in future, if you're ever looking up hex codes, Google is your best friend. So see here, the first website I actually used is Wikipedia. So the first color I'll be using is Copper Penny, and this will be the first one in the description. So just copy it, go to color, and then hex, and then just paste it. And now we have our basic color. The next thing I want to change is the roughness. I want it to be more reflective, so lower values give you more reflectivity. But never use 0, because nothing in the real world is 100% reflective. So even if you're using a mirror or something, use very low values. So in this case, I'll just be using 0.05. It's always a good idea to just have a small bit of noise, no matter how reflective it is. It's just a very small subtle thing that just adds to the realism for your material. So next thing I want to be doing is actually blending this glossy with another color. So shader, mix shader. And I'll be connecting it to an anisotropic node. So I'll connect it like this. Well, I'll be leaving the distribution at 50%, so 0.5 will do just fine. So, if you don't know what the key differences between anisotropic and glossy are, they're essentially the same thing, except anisotropic actually has, anisotropic. This just means that in terms of light here, like we're doing in Blender, it just means that the reflected light is different when viewed from different angles. So see, if I give the floor an anisotropic shader, you will actually see what I'm talking about much easier. It's just a lot easier to see than describe. So you see here, the light is being distributed kind of circularly. So I kind of want this effect for my copper, so that's what I'm going to use. This is the reason I'm not using a regular glossy. So next thing to change, of course, is the color. So again, go to... Now for this one, I'll actually be keeping the roughness as it is at 0.2, as I don't want all of my metallic areas to be completely reflective. So I'll actually be leaving all these at the default. Of course, unmute this. There we go. And the next thing is one more mix shader, and I'll be adding another glossy. There we go, glossy, and connect it like this. And again, leave the distribution at 0.5 and roughness 0.05, and my final color is from here, which is also in the description. Okay. There we go. So now we have our basic overall color for our copper material. But if you'll see in my preview render, you see these small, fine details. This is using bump mapping. And for most of it, I actually just used a texture generated by Blender, a noise texture. So let's do that. Go Shift A, texture, noise texture. And to have the noise texture actually affect the surface of our material, we need to use a bump node. So connect this to here, to height, and then connect normal to the normal of each of your shaders. Be careful not to add it to tangent for anisotropic. So there we go. So now if you see in our preview, we see these bumps. It's working correctly, as it should be, but this is not the effect we're going for. We want the bumps to be much, much smaller. So change the scale to something much larger. In my preview, I used 500. But now you'll see it's looking kind of horrible. This is because our strength for our bump node is very high. Usually good values to use between 0.1 and 2. But in my preview, I used 0.2, so I'll use that. So now if we zoom in and we take a small look, you can see that we have a kind of a grainy effect, which adds to the realism of the material and makes it look much more believable. Now this next part is optional. I just did this just to add a bit more variation to the bumping. I actually used an image texture I downloaded from the internet. I'll show you. If you go texture, image texture, and if I find my texture, I'm sorry I cannot give this to you because for copyright reasons, but I'm sure if you go to Google and you type in scratch bump map, you'll find something similar. As you can see, it's just a bunch of lines, horizontal, vertical, diagonal lines. You could even create it something like it in GIMP very easily. Now, first thing I want to change is the mapping of the image. So add a texture coordinate and make it generated. This is because by default the image texture node uses the UV coordinates, but if your shape, like me in this situation, is not using Okay, so now we have to blend the noise and the image together. So go Shift A, Converter, Math, and just leave it add, and just connect these together. Okay, so now you see, if I zoom in, we just have a bit more variety in our scratching, and now sorry, a bump. So you have small lines appearing that do the job for us. Okay, so that's it for the bump mapping. And now, one more thing I need to do before our material is complete is you'll see here in the preview, the material is actually giving off some blue light. What we have right now, as you can see in our preview, is just, it's basically dark brass, isn't it? It's not really copperish. In the real world, if you see copper, it actually gives off, areas of it actually give off a blue tint. So, this is what we're going to be doing next. But before we add a blue tint, I'm going to be doing one more thing. And that is, I'm going to duplicate this mix shader, add it here, and I'll actually be using this very same glossy shader. I'll be plugging it into here. The reason for this is I want this glossy shader to actually be the overall, be dominant over these two here. I want this to be the overall color for my copper material. But I don't like the way it's been distributed here by this mix shader. If you see here, if we add 1, this means it is 100% of this glossy, and if we go 0, it is 100% erased. If we leave it as 0.5 as it is, it's half and half. It's distributed perfectly evenly along the shape, and that's not really what I'm looking for. As you see in the preview, the blue only appears in some areas. So to do this, I'm going to go to Shift A, Input, and Fresnel. And we go here, and we connect it to here. It does the job for us. It's a very subtle change. You probably won't even notice it, but basically what it does is it makes... Okay, and so now for the blue tint. Again, one last mix shader, and put it here, and then another anisotropic shader, and connect it here. But for this one, I'll actually be leaving the roughness as it is, and the anisotropy as it is. All I'm going to be doing is changing color. So, I don't actually remember the hex I used in my preview, so I'm just going to use something similar. Just a very pale blue. Quite bright also. Don't go too overboard, don't give it this color. You see, it looks horrible. Just do something very subtle. Even if you don't really notice the difference here in the preview, Blender will. And it will give you accurate results. So something like this, if you would like, you can use my hex. It's CAF3FF. Okay, so again, we have the same issue of the distribution between the two shaders. As you can see now, it's half anisotropic and half of everything else. But to change the distribution in the way I want it to be, I'm going to go to Input, Layer Weight, and I will be using the Fresnel to determine the distribution. So this does something similar to the Fresnel here, but it also has a very subtle blue tinge. See, if I mute this mix shader by hitting M, you see the difference fairly clearly. This is very bright and saturated, while this is just more, it just looks right to me anyway. Anyway, so that's it. That's the material, the copper material. I hope you learned something from this. I hope it was useful to you. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.